Check out these creepy videos. I bet you would feel sorry for those that were on the receiving end of the actions in real life. Have you heard the story of the W? Think about it like a scenario where saying the word out loud would mean you are summoning the spirit. This story is not just creepy, it is strange.
I have been getting many requests to tell this story from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I've heard that the legend is that if you say this word that starts with a W, then you are calling it to come to you. Similar to if you say a demon's name out loud, then you're summoning the demon to come to you. So throughout the story, I will be referring to this word as just the W. This is one of the stories that really got to me when I was little. The story goes like there was a wealthy man who wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where it was not really safe to go hunting. He stopped at a trading post nearby to try to find a guide to take him to this spot so that he could hunt there, but nobody wanted to go because of the location. That is until he came upon an indigenous man named Fedego, sorry if I said that wrong, who needed the money and agreed to be his guide. They made it to their destination, set up camp near a large frozen lake, and hunted, but by the third day they still hadn't caught anything. That night they were both in their tents trying to go to sleep when a windstorm came. The man could hear the wind howling outside of his tent and couldn't fall asleep because it was so loud. So he got out of his sleeping bag and looked out his tent, but to his surprise, he didn't see any wind. In fact, the trees were still. The man tried going back to sleep when the wind started up again, but this time it was howling and started sounding like it was howling Fedego's name. The man went over to Fedego's tent to see if Fedego heard it too, and he noticed that Fedego was out of his sleeping bag, huddled in the corner of his tent, rocking back and forth, all the while the wind still howling Fedego's name. The man asked, "Do you hear that? What is that?" Fedego said, "It's nothing." However, the wind kept howling Fedego's name, calling out for him, and eventually Fedego got up and ran out of his tent. He ran into the woods, and the hunter could hear Fedego screaming in the distance as he got farther and farther away, screaming, "How my feet burn, my burning feet, my fiery burning feet," until just like that, Fedego's screams stopped, and so did the wind. The next morning, the hunter went out to look for Fedego and followed his footsteps through the snow. He followed them through the forest and finally out onto the lake. But the footprints grew longer and longer until they got to an inhuman size. And once they got out onto the middle of the lake, the footprints just stopped. It was as if something had swooped Fedego into the sky when he got to the middle of the lake. But the hunter thought, that's impossible. He waited for Fedego, but Fedego never showed up, and he eventually made his way back into town. The next year, he decided he wanted to go back to that same place. He went to the trading post to try to find a guide, and he was asking people what they think happened to Fedego and if anybody had seen him. I hate doing part 2s, but I ran out of time, so part 2.
Now you know of the W, but what do you really know of how it comes with the wind and gets its victims? Check this clip out.
Part 2. While the man was at the trading post trying to find a guide, he was telling people at the trading post about what transpired that night and how Fedego never came back, and they all said that they have not seen Fedego since. And that's when somebody at the trading post said, well, maybe it was a W. The hunter said, a what? And the person responded, well, according to legend, it's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along until your feet burn up to nothing but ash, and then it swoops you up into the sky, carries you, and drops you. A few days later, the hunter went back to the trading post, and that's when a man walked in with a hat and a blanket wrapped around him so that you couldn't see his face. But the hunter felt something familiar about him, and he went over to the man after the man had taken a seat, and he said, "Are you Fedego?" The man didn't answer. He didn't even move. The hunter said, "Do you know anything about him?" Again, the man didn't answer. The hunter then said, "Are you all right?" The man still didn't answer, so the hunter lifted his hat, and that's when he saw that wrapped in the blanket was not a man. There was no head, no body, just a big pile of ashes.
Today, the world sees vampire stories as nothing more than stories. But what if it was more than that? What if there were real-life simulations causing disorders in people that brought about the vampire rumor tales we know?
Where did the myths of vampires actually come from? Like many myths, it is based partly in fact. Back in the 1700s, a blood disorder called porphyria became prevalent among the people of Eastern Europe. Porphyria is an inherited blood disorder that causes many vampire-like side effects, like the following. Extreme sensitivity to sunlight, which led to facial disfigurement that caused the gums to recede, exposing the teeth, which then look like fangs. Next, blood drinking. Because the urine of people with porphyria is dark red, folklore surmised that they were drinking blood. In fact, some physicians had recommended that these patients drink animal blood to compensate for the defect in their red blood cells. Next, fear of the crucifix. During the Spanish Inquisition, 600 vampires were reportedly burned at the stake. Some of these accused vampires were innocent sufferers of porphyria. So porphyria patients had good reason to fear the Christian faith and Christian symbols. So vampires didn't exist in our world, but where vampires do exist is in the supernatural fantasy world of Myths of Moonrise. Myths of Moonrise is a match 3 puzzle and simulation game that includes vampires, werewolves, mages, and demons, where players can obtain heroes, establish their own territory of power, and have PvP confrontations. Click here on my profile to get it.
You could think it to be a dumb horror story, but does the person next to you think so too? In this clip, we see two friends who took the horror story of Slender Man to a whole new level in trying to unalive their friend.
The Slenderman attack.
There's this website called the Creepypasta Wiki.
Okay.
It's full of like horror stories that are meant to purposely scare you through like online literature and all that.
Okay.
And there's one of them called Slenderman. Morgan said, "Hey Anissa, we should be proxies."
And they asked if they could go to the park. And I didn't think anything of it. I said, yeah, of course you can go to the park.
I give it back to her and say, "You do it, go ballistic." And she said, "Okay, I'll go ballistic whenever, when you say you want me to." I told her that I didn't care when she did it. And she said, "Whatever." So I started walking away. And then Morgan jumped on top of Bella and started stabbing her repeatedly.
This is the story of the scary woman at the beachside, going after unsuspecting campers by the beach who probably just wanted to wake up to the view of the sun rising.
I'm losing my mind over this. This could actually be a picture of the Lone Rock Woman. There are these long-standing legends of Lone Rock Beach of a murderous woman who roams the beach at night and she goes after campers. These police descriptions of a woman with wild hair and these menacing eyes, but it's always just kind of been a story. There was never really any proof of this until a phone turned up on the beach. So 3 teenagers found an iPhone that was abandoned in the sand, and before they turned it in, they did what anybody would do. They would browse the camera roll. They ended up finding this unnerving photo of a woman who clearly took this photo with the self-timer, and she roughly seemed to match the description. When police eventually turned the phone back to the owner, they did not recognize the woman, and nobody else on that beach the day that the photo was taken seemed to spot her, leaving us with the question, could this be the only known photo of the murderous woman of Lone Rock Beach?
What do you think your last words would be? Check out this clip to know the last words of some criminals. Look out for the one that says, "I'll be back."
These are some of the scariest last words ever said by serial killers. And I found all these on Reddit. Number 1 is Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, and he ate a lot of people. And his last words were, "I don't care if I live or if I die, so go ahead and kill me." Number 2 is Peter Kürten, aka the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Peter was on death row for killing over 60 people and drinking some of their blood. And his last words were, "Tell me, after my head's been chopped off, would I be able to hear the blood gushing out of my head?" Number 3, John Avalos Alba. John was on death row for fatally shooting his wife while he was on probation. And his last words were, "Okay, warden, let's do it. I love y'all. I can taste it already. I'm starting to go." Next up, we have Jimmy Glass. Jimmy was on death row after he escaped prison and went on to kill 2 people. And his last words were, "I'd rather be fishing." And finally, we have Eileen Wuornos. Eileen was on death row for killing 7 men between 1989 and 1990. And her last words were, "I'd like to say I'll be sailing with The Rock, and I'll be back on Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, just like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Hearing all of this was haunting, but that's why.
What did Walmart hide from the world? One woman says she saw a big hole being dug into the ground. But what for? We might never get to know.
Walmart is hiding something horrifying.
In 2015, Walmart randomly closed locations in California, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Tulsa, saying that it was just plumbing problems. At first, nobody thought anything of it, but things started getting stranger by the day. You see, people thought it was weird that the plumbing problems were so severe that it was taking 6 months to fix. And not only that, military and police officers were moving in and out of these Walmart locations, building what seemed like defenses outside of these Walmarts. And a woman even broke through the barrier and said when she went inside the abandoned Walmart, she saw a giant hole dug up in the center of the store. And it seemed like something weird was going on. And it was even rumored that these locations were being turned into FEMA concentration camps. This is actually insanely scary, so let me know if you want me to make a part 2.
When a town gets burned to the ground, not once, but 3 times, it begins to look suspicious. This is the tale of the haunted town of Haunted Jerome in Arizona.
This town is so haunted, it's burned to the ground 3 separate times. This is the notoriously spooky Jerome, Arizona. Known as the wickedest town in the West, Jerome, Arizona burned down 3 times in 3 years in the late 1800s. Back in the day, it was known for copper mining and also became notorious for its seediness. But over time, population dwindled and it became a ghost town. The whole town is thought to be haunted, but the Jerome Grand Hotel itself has a really creepy history. Before it was a hotel, it was a hospital where an estimated 9,000 souls spent their final hours. It opened to guests in the 90s, and visitors here report some pretty strange occurrences. Often, folks will report waking up to the sound of someone breathing in their room, only to turn on the light and no one's there. Lights flicker. Others report the sound of someone crying to the front desk, only for staff to check and find the room that the crying is coming from is completely empty. Have you revisited, and do you think you could last a night here?
What do you think of the light coming on a top floor of an abandoned insane asylum? A determined explorer, or the spirit of one of the patients that died in the asylum?
What is going on in this abandoned insane asylum in Russia?
Okay, so this abandoned insane asylum in Russia that you see right here has been abandoned for years and completely untouched. But one night, somebody spotted a light on in one of the top floors, and nobody knows what it is or what caused it. As you can see, there is a light lighting up the entire window. Many people think it's a person's spirit who died in this insane asylum, or it's just some explorers exploring an abandoned building. But let's be honest, who's climbing that many floors in an abandoned insane asylum? This is absolutely terrifying, and I think it's a spirit of a patient who went here.
This is the tale of Mona Fandey, the tale of a woman who wanted to be a pop star but turned to witchcraft when her pop dream didn't work out.
This is Mona Fandey. Mona always wanted to be a pop star, but when that didn't work out, she turned to witchcraft. Both Mona and her husband started offering their services to many elite customers, and the duo became very successful in this business. That's when the couple was approached by a politician named Mazlan Idris. He wanted help with his campaign. Once Mona and her husband received payment, they invited Mazlan to their home for a black magic cleansing ritual. And with the help of a couple assistants, they told Mazlan to lay down on the floor, close his eyes, and envision money falling from the sky. Then, without warning, the assistant chopped Mazlan's head off with an axe. Mona, her husband, and the assistant then dismembered and skinned his body. And 18 pieces were found on Mona's property in an outbuilding, buried in this storeroom. Some parts of the body were never found, and it was speculated that the trio ate them. While the murder itself is brutal, the creepiest part is the events that happened afterwards. His assistant was arrested a couple days later on unrelated drug charges, and he told police what he had done. Mona and her husband were both sentenced to death, but even after her sentencing, Mona wouldn't shield her face from the cameras. Instead, she would pose and smile. It took the jury less than 70 minutes to come to a verdict. Mona and her husband were sentenced to execution by hanging. After hearing her ultimatum, Mona said, "I'm happy and thank you to all Malaysians." And just before being hung at the gallows, her last words were, "I will never die."
Which of these encounters do you count as the scariest? Let us know what you think in the comments section.